In the pre-dawn cold of a November morning in the year of our Lord 1887, Josiah Creel came riding up to the Solvang cabin with two railroad men at his back and a leather portfolio tucked under his arm like the Bible of some gospel he believed in utterly. And though Britta had been awake since before first light, as was her habit, risen to start the fire and set the coffee pot on to boil and tend to the small grievances of the homestead, she had not expected him, had not prepared for the particular kind of desolation that comes when you open your door and see your life divided into before and after by the mere presence of a man in a brown overcoat carrying a walking cane with a silver handle. A man who moved with the certainty of absolute entitlement, as if the earth itself had arranged itself to accommodate his progress. And when she saw him, she felt her stomach contract as if her body knew something that her mind was only beginning to comprehend. She stood on the porch with Leif's small hand clasped in hers, the boy still drowsy against the folds of her skirt, his 5-year-old eyes barely open to the gray morning light that had only just begun to stain the sky above the valley like ink spreading through water. And she watched as Creel dismounted with a kind of theatrical heaviness, watched his thick frame descend from the saddle, as if the very earth needed to feel the weight of his arrival, his boots striking the frozen ground with a sound like judgment, and he came toward the cabin with his mouth already working itself into the shape of speech, already preparing the words he would use to explain how her husband's death 6 weeks prior, Eric crushed under a fallen log while working the timber claim that had put food on their table and kept a roof over their heads, had left her indebted to the Northern Pacific Railroad for timber hauling fees that had never been agreed upon, for services rendered that had never been contracted, for debts that existed nowhere but in the careful, meticulous forgery contained in the papers he now withdrew from his portfolio with fingers as thick and brutal as railroad spikes, his nails dark with something that might have been dirt or blood or the simple grime of a man who did not think himself subject to the laws of cleanliness or decency. Britta could read English well enough. Her father had taught her from a leather-bound primer brought from Bergen, insisting with a carpenter's stubbornness that a girl with a sharp mind ought to have the tools to use it, that learning was not a luxury, but a necessity, that the written word was a kind of power that no one could take from her once she possessed it. And she read enough of those papers, despite Creel's refusal to slow his speech or repeat himself, despite the way he spoke at her as if she were a child or a foreigner or both, to understand that they were lies in the most elaborate sense, that the name of her husband had been forged with a crude hand that bore no resemblance to Eric's careful script, the script she still saw in her mind's eye from years of reading his letters before he had learned to read fluently and write with confidence, that the amounts listed were grotesque exaggerations pulled from air and malice, some so large they could only have come from an imagination devoted to cruelty. And she said this much to Creel, her voice steady but touched with the accent that marked her as foreign, as outside, as someone who had not yet earned the right to dispute the word of a railroad man, an accent that seemed to amuse him, that made something cruel light up in his small eyes, and Creel looked at her with an expression of such elaborate contempt that she felt it like a physical thing, like a hand pressing against her chest, like the weight of the entire sky settling on her shoulders, like the judgment of all the world crystallized into a single moment of dismissal. And he told her in a voice that admitted no argument, that allowed for no discussion, that had the quality of law and fate intertwined, that she and her boy had until the noon hour to remove themselves and their belongings from the cabin and the 40 acres surrounding it, which were now, by the authority of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, and by documents that he assured her were entirely legitimate despite her protestations, despite her reading of them, the legal property of said railroad, and that any attempt to remain past that hour would result in her arrest for trespassing, would result in her being separated from her child and taken to jail, where women like her, foreign women, women of questionable virtue, who lived alone with men not their fathers, were not treated with what one might call gentleness, and that the railroad was being generous in giving her 4 hours at all, that many women in her situation had been given considerably less, that she ought to be grateful for the time she had been allotted, that she ought to thank him for his mercy. The two men at his back said nothing, merely shifted their weight from one foot to the other and looked at the mountains in the distance as if they had no stake in the brutality of what was transpiring, as if they were mere instruments without will or conscience, servants of something larger than themselves. And Creel turned his horse without waiting for a response, as if her response could possibly matter, as if she had any voice at all in the execution of his will, as if she were anything more than a minor obstacle to be removed from the path of progress, and rode back down the trail with his men, leaving Britta standing on her porch with life's hand still in hers, feeling the small fingers flex and grip tighter, as if even a 5-year-old could understand that something fundamental in the world had cracked, that the rules that had governed their days had suddenly, and without warning, become something else entirely. And his voice, when he finally spoke, was very small, very young, asking his mother if they were to leave now, if they were to be turned out like the foxes that the farmers shot at the edge of the property. She did not waste time in shock or despair. There was no luxury for that, not with a child depending on her, not with 4 hours standing between her and displacement, not with the terrible clarity of a deadline marking the boundary between one life and another. And she went inside the cabin and stood in the main room where she and Eric had lived for 3 years, where Leif had been born, in the bed that still stood in the corner with its quilts that her mother-in-law had stitched with tiny, careful stitches, where she had cooked and mended and planned for a future that no longer existed, where every corner held a memory that was about to become merely a memory, a ghost story she could tell herself about the life she had almost had, and she began to gather what could be carried with the methodical precision of someone who understands that choice itself is a luxury she can afford only if she makes it quickly, and that hesitation would lead only to paralysis. Her father's woodworking tools first, and she handled them with the care that one reserves for sacred objects, wrapped them carefully in oilcloth, because they were not just tools, but a language she understood, a way of making something hold together, of joining pieces, so they became stronger than they were apart, a knowledge that her father had transferred to her hands through years of patient instruction in his workshop in Bergen, through endless hours of watching and learning and practicing, until the motions became part of her muscle memory, part of the knowledge that lived in her bones, something deeper than thought or memory, something that existed in the fiber of her being. The hand plane with its worn wooden sole, darkened by decades of use, its blade sharp enough still to shave the fine hairs on her forearm, a tool that had belonged to her grandfather and possibly to generations before him. The chisels with their birch handles smooth from her father's own hands, and now destined to be held by hers, worn in places where his palm had gripped them 10,000 times. The draw knife that could shape wood like water, that could turn rough timber into something approaching beauty with just the right pressure and angle. A tool that required understanding, that demanded a conversation between hand and wood. The small bow saw with its taut blade and brass fixtures, old enough to have been her grandfather's and possibly his grandfather's before him, tools that represented a continuity that could not be broken by a railroad man and his forged papers and his casual cruelty. Tools that were the closest thing to family she could carry with her. She gathered these as if they were sacred things, because they were, because they connected her to her father in Bergen and to generations of men who had made things with their hands and their knowledge and their will, and to the possibility that her hands could still make something in this world besides despair, that her labor could create rather than merely survive, that even in darkness and stone she could fashion something that held together. Then the cast-iron cooking pot that had belonged to Eric's mother, heavy as a stone and twice as necessary, a pot that had traveled across an ocean in a ship's hold, that had been used to cook 1,000 meals, that had fed a family, that carried history in its weight, and the flour that would not last long, perhaps 3 weeks if they were careful, perhaps 2 if the winter came early and hard as her instincts told her it would, as her bones were already beginning to whisper to her in their ancient language, and the salt in its sealed jar, salt that was worth its weight in money in a place so far from the sea, that represented flavor and preservation and the possibility of not eating the same tasteless things day after day, and the dried fish wrapped in cloth, fish that her grandmother had taught her to cure before she left Norway, fish that could sustain a person when fresh meat was impossible and stores ran low and hope itself became a luxury. Her husband's heavy wool coat that still held the shape of his shoulders, a coat she had carefully maintained despite her grief, that still smelled of tobacco and the cedar chips she had used to protect it from moths, a coat that represented the warmth of his body and the presence of his protection, even if that protection was now only a memory, even if it was now merely cloth and wool, even if it would have to serve the function that he had once served in a more literal sense. And she wrapped it around her shoulders as she gathered the rest, because she was already feeling the cold in a new way, as if her body knew that it was about to be exposed to the full force of winter. A kerosene storm lantern with its glass sides intact. This was essential, crucial beyond measure, the kind of thing that could mean the difference between freezing in darkness and finding your way through it, between madness and some basic human connection to light and warmth in the outside world, and a tin of matches sealed in oilcloth because fire was survival, and survival was everything, because without fire, there was nothing but slow decline into cold and darkness and death, and matches were gold in a place where replacing them meant a long walk to town and money she did not possess. Eric's Bible, though she was not a particularly religious woman, because it had come across the ocean in his mother's hands, and because there was comfort in the weight of tradition, even when tradition had failed to protect her from anything, had failed to stop a log from falling, had failed to prevent suffering, had failed to honor the covenant between God and men that the Bible claimed existed, but because there was something about holding it, something about the leather binding and the gilt edges and the familiar Latin phrases that connected her to the life she had left behind and the life her son would need to carry forward. Blankets, every blanket they possessed, 6 of them, wool that had been dyed with her own hands, using plants she had learned to identify in this strange new land, wool that held the warmth when wrapped tight around a body, wool that was softer on the inside than on the outside, wool that was like skin made of fiber, and Leif's small wooden horse, carved by his father in the evenings by lamplight, carved with a patience that Eric had not always possessed in other areas of his life, carved with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of love, worn smooth by 5 years of small fingers and fevered dreams, the horse that represented all of his known past, all of the days before his father died and the world changed, before exile became possible, before everything became conditional and temporary. She wrapped these things in canvas and burlap and tied them onto the small hand sled that Eric had built for hauling supplies from town, built with the same care he had given to everything, built so well that it had never needed repair. And she looked around the cabin one final time, at the stove she had learned to maintain, learning its temperament like a person learns to read another's moods, learning when it was hungry and when it was satisfied, at the shelves she had filled with the goods of their survival, at the small bed where her son had been born, at the table where they had eaten their meals together, at the corner where Eric had worked in the evenings, at every detail that had become so familiar it had become invisible, at the home she had made. And then she took Leif's hand and walked out the door and did not look back, because looking back would have stopped her, and stopping was a luxury she could not afford, because her son was depending on her, because the only thing left was forward, because every moment they remained was a moment the railroad men might return and take even what they now carried. The trail from the cabin led up into the foothills, away from the valley and the town and the railroad's jurisdiction, and Britta pulled the sled behind her with one hand and held Leif's hand with the other, and the boy walked beside her without complaint, understanding in the way that children do when something fundamental has shifted, when the ordinary rules no longer apply, when his mother's face has taken on a kind of clarity that demands he be brave, that requires he pretend he is not frightened, and they moved through the morning together, mother and son, with everything they possessed heaped on the sled behind them, moving deeper into the mountains, moving away from what had been toward what would be. They walked through the thin cold that cuts at your face and your lungs both, cold that makes breathing feel like an act of willful defiance, cold that seems to be the default state of the world, and they left the trail eventually and moved higher into the rocky terrain where the ponderosa pines grew sparse and the stone seemed to shoulder itself up from the earth like something trying to be born, like some creature struggling to emerge from the ground's dark womb, and the landscape became more hostile and more indifferent, became a thing that cared nothing for them, their survival, their hopes or fears or future. It was the 4th day of their walking, when the food from the cabin was nearly exhausted, and Leif had begun to complain of his feet, when the cold seemed to have settled into Britta's bones in a way that no amount of movement could warm, when she was beginning to understand that they could not continue indefinitely without shelter, when she was beginning to understand that whatever happened next would determine everything that followed, when the universe seemed to pivot on the next hours, when Britta found it, a dark mouth in the hillside, a horizontal adit cut into the mountainside years ago by men with picks and determination, and the fevered dream belief that silver lay waiting in the stone for any man patient enough to dig, for any man willing to spend his youth and strength and hope on the possibility of wealth. And though those men had abandoned the mine, had moved on to other claims in other valleys where they believed fortune waited more readily, they had left behind the bones of their work, the architecture of their ambition, the remnants of their failed dreams. The mine entrance was framed in timber, rough-hewn beams that had weathered to a silver gray in the 15 years since the mining boom had passed through the territory. And inside the entrance, the rails were visible, old iron rails set in the stone, the kind used for pushing carts of ore from the mountain's depths to the light, rails that now lay rusted and silent, rails that had led men deeper and deeper into darkness in pursuit of wealth they would never find, rails that now led deeper into shadow, rails that might lead Britta and Leif toward something that resembled shelter, toward something that resembled a future. Britta stood at the entrance with Leif pressed against her leg, and she lit the kerosene lantern with trembling hands, watching as the light pushed back the dark in a golden circle that seemed impossibly small against the vast darkness of the mine's interior. And the light itself seemed like a kind of prayer, a kind of defiance. And she took a breath and walked into the mine shaft, and her son followed without hesitation because he had learned in 4 days that his mother's choices were the only choices available to him now, that her will was the closest thing to safety the world still offered, that survival was something achieved together or not at all, and the sound of their footsteps echoed back to them from the stone, doubling, tripling, creating the illusion that there were many of them, that they were not alone. The shaft was 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, high enough that she did not have to bow, and it extended in a straight line into the mountain, and as she walked deeper, pulling the sled behind her, the wheels sometimes catching on slight irregularities in the stone floor, the echo of the sled's movement bouncing back from the walls and ceiling and floor in complex patterns, Leif's small hand still gripped in hers, his breathing audible in the darkness, rapid and shallow at first, then gradually slowing, becoming normal. She began to notice that the air was changing in some fundamental way, that the bitter cold that had stalked them on the trail outside was receding like a tide withdrawing from shore, and the closer to the back of the shaft she moved, the warmer the air became, until she reached a point perhaps 40 feet from the entrance where the temperature was mild, almost warm, almost like the inside of a house in autumn, almost like stepping into a space that had not been touched by the coming winter, almost like stepping into the interior of the earth itself. She set down the sled, and she held the lantern high, and she looked around her at the ancient timber shoring that held the roof, at the rough walls of stone that had been widened by pick and labor, at the silence that pressed down from the mountain itself, at the iron rails that disappeared deeper into darkness, at the evidence of human effort and human hope. And she understood with a clarity that seemed to strike her like revelation, like the voice of God speaking through stone and earth and time, that the earth itself was warmer the deeper you descended, that stone held heat from the center of the world, that the mountain had its own interior life, its own way of providing for those who knew how to read it, that the very ground beneath her feet was offering shelter in a way that the surface of the earth no longer could, that this abandoned mine shaft, this failed dream of other men, might become the salvation of herself and her son. She thought of her father in Bergen, of the way he had taught her to see the grain in wood, to understand how things held together, to listen to what materials were telling her. And she thought that perhaps this darkness and this stone and this unexpected warmth were not the end of things, but rather a different kind of beginning. A trial, perhaps, but not a defeat. And she felt something shift inside her, some small spark of hope reignite in a place where she had feared it had been extinguished forever. And she squeezed Leif's hand and felt him squeeze back. And she knew that he too understood that they had found something, though he could not yet know what it would mean. She slept that first night with Leif curled against her chest, both of them wrapped in their blankets there on the warm stone floor, 40 feet inside the mountain, the lantern burning low at their feet, the light making shadow shapes on the timber-shored walls, and the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight seemed almost protective, almost like an embrace, and she did not sleep as one sleeps in safety. That luxury was gone, perhaps forever, but as one sleeps with one eye open, one hand always ready, one part of the mind always listening to the silence that might at any moment become something else, become the sound of collapse, become the sound of danger, become the sound of pursuit, but instead, the silence remained constant and even, and the warmth from the mountain's interior seemed to settle around them like a blessing, like something beyond luck or fortune. For 2 weeks after that first night, Britta set about the work of making a home from the stone and timber that the mountain offered her, and she did this work with the same quiet deliberation that her father had used when constructing furniture, understanding at a level deeper than thought that the quality of her labor would determine the quality of her survival, that shortcuts taken now would compound into suffering later, that excellence was not a luxury but a necessity, that every joint properly made, every surface properly finished, every support properly placed was an investment in endurance and longevity and permanence. Using the hand plane that had been her father's, she smoothed the surfaces of old mine timber, timber that had been left behind when the mine was abandoned, timber that had dried for 15 years in the mountain's constant, gentle warmth, and the feel of the plane moving across the wood was familiar to her in a way that nothing else in this new life was familiar. The slight resistance as the sharp blade caught and lifted the grain, the fragrance of wood shavings curling from the blade, the pale spiral of wood that came away under her hands, the transformation of rough timber into something approaching smooth, something approaching usable, something that bore the mark of her intentionality and skill. And from this timber she constructed a door for the entrance of the shaft, a door that would keep out the wind and the worst of the cold, a door that would seal them in and mark the boundary between the world outside and the world inside, a door that was made from her own hands and her own knowledge and her own will, a door that said without words that this was a dwelling, that this was chosen, that this was intentional. She built shelving along the walls using old iron brackets that had once held equipment and her own carefully placed stones as anchors. And these shelves became repositories for their supplies, for the flour and salt and dried fish, arranged so that nothing would roll or fall, everything accessible even in darkness, everything positioned with the precision of someone who understood that disorganization in a place like this could become a matter of life and death, that chaos led to suffering, that order was a form of grace. She fashioned a raised sleeping platform from old mine timber, building a frame with the kind of joinery that her father had taught her, using mortise and tenon connections rather than nails, creating something that would hold together not through the strength of fasteners but through the marriage of wood to wood, through the way grain aligned with grain and joint locked with joint, and laying planks across it, creating a surface that would be above the stone floor, above the moisture that sometimes seeped and pooled, a place of rest that represented everything she had learned about how to make one thing from another. And when she and Leaf first lay upon it, she felt the rightness of it, felt how it held their weight without complaint, how it was exactly what they needed. She built a small stone hearth near the entrance to the shaft, carefully selecting rocks and laying them in a pattern that would cradle a fire without letting the heat escape directly into stone that might crack and shatter. And she tested this hearth with small fires, learning how the smoke moved through the shaft, rising naturally and venting out through the mouth at the mountain's face like breath from a living thing. And she learned to feed the fire slowly and carefully so that it burned steady and hot, without producing so much smoke that it became unbearable, without flooding the living space with fumes. And on the day she first cooked a real meal, the smell of meat warming in the pot seemed to her like the smell of civilization itself, like the smell of survival. On her 8th day in the mine, she discovered a seep of water, a trickle that emerged from the stone wall 30 feet in, a small but constant flow that she could cup in her hands and drink, water that was cold and clean, and that spoke to her of deep sources, of the mountain's secret veins, of a life that extended far below the surface where she now dwelt, of an entire world beneath the world, of an architecture of water and stone and time that was older than any human purpose. And she fashioned a catch for this water. A depression in the stone widened over days with careful work from a chisel, a place where the water could gather in a small pool before running off into the deeper darkness. And she tested this water obsessively at first, tasting it repeatedly to make sure it held no metallic tang, that it was not poisoned by the earth's old minerals, and though there was sometimes a faint iron taste, it seemed to her clean enough, vital enough, alive enough to sustain them, and she understood that she would never need to leave the mountain for water, that this essential thing had been provided for them in the darkness. She hung blankets as partitions, creating a kind of second room deeper in the shaft, a place where the warmth was even more pronounced, where the air was almost thick with heat radiating from deep within the mountain, a place where she could fold the fabric of their few possessions into something approaching privacy. And she built a second shelf for storing food, positioned carefully so that heat from the earth would not spoil things, would not encourage rot or pest. And she fashioned a small table from old timbers and 2 stools, simple constructions of wood fitted together without nails, because she had learned from her father that joinery was stronger, cleaner, more honest than mere fastening, that a thing properly joined would outlast a thing merely bolted together, and these pieces of furniture became the center of their interior world, the place where she and Leif sat and ate the thin soups and hard bread that had become their diet, the place where she could sometimes see in her son's face something other than fear, something that might have been contentment, might have been the beginning of adaptation, might have been the first fragile shoots of something approaching hope. On the 12th day, she climbed out of the mine and walked with Leif down to Mill Creek, the nearest settlement, a place of perhaps 30 buildings strung along a single muddy street that would turn to ice within weeks, a place that suddenly felt foreign and hostile, despite being only half a day's walk from where they had built their new life, a place that belonged to a world that had already become smaller and more distant. The general store was run by a man named Pruitt and his wife Agnes, a thin woman with sharp features and a sharp tongue to match, and Britta entered the store with Leaf at her side and a collection of her husband's iron nails in a cloth sack, nails that Eric had purchased for projects he had planned but never lived to undertake, nails that had value in a place where supplies were not easy to come by, nails that now represented her only currency. She spoke to Pruitt about trading these nails for flour and salt, and he gave her perhaps half what they were worth, but he gave her what she needed, and she was placing the goods into a sack when Mrs. Agnes Pruitt emerged from the back room and saw the tattered hem of her skirt, the rope she was using as a belt, the dirt under her fingernails from the work in the mine, the frost in her golden blonde braid, the way her clothes hung on her frame now that she was eating less and working harder, and the woman's face arranged itself into an expression of such elaborate pity mixed with contempt that Britta felt it like a slap across the face, like a judgment spoken aloud. "Mrs. Pruitt asked, in a voice loud enough that the two railroad wives shopping near the dry goods were sure to hear every word, whether Britta was living in a hole in the ground like some kind of animal, whether she thought that was a suitable place for raising a Christian child, whether she wasn't ashamed to be living like a savage instead of like a civilized woman. And though Britta did not respond, did not have the words or perhaps had too many words, and knew that none of them would matter, knew that her accent would make anything she said seem like the mewling of something less than human. The laughter that followed her out of the store was sharp and cold and seemed to follow her all the way back down the trail, seemed to echo in her ears long after she had climbed back into the mine and sealed the door behind her. And she understood in that moment that the townspeople had already decided what she was, had decided that she had failed, and that whatever happened next would either vindicate that judgment or reverse it absolutely. She had been in the mine for 16 days when Josiah Creel appeared in Mill Creek, and though Britta did not know he was there until the Reverend, a well-meaning but weak-spined man named Thaddeus Cooper, a man who preached charity while doing nothing to extend it, a man who had never had to choose between his convictions and his comfort, came to the mine entrance one afternoon looking uncomfortable and apologetic, came to find her and tell her that Creel had been asking about her, spreading word that the mine itself was railroad property, that she was a squatter and a fool, and that he would have her removed before the first snow fell, that the railroad could not allow every homeless person in the territory to take shelter in mines that represented potential corporate assets, that her presence there was theft, was trespassing, was a crime against property and order. The Reverend suggested, with what he seemed to believe was kindness, that she might consider sending Leif to a church boarding school in Helena, that the boy would be better served by Christian education and a Christian home, that it was not a mother's place to drag a child into poverty and darkness, that she was being selfish in her insistence on keeping him with her when she could not provide for him properly, that she was denying him the chance to become a proper Christian boy. And Britta listened to this speech with her face still and her hands folded in her lap, feeling something harden inside her, something crystallize into certainty, something become absolute and immovable. And when the Reverend had finished, she told him quietly, but with a certainty that admitted no argument, that she would never give up her son, that the boarding school was for children whose mothers had failed them, and that she wasn't failing, that she would not fail, that Leif would stay with her, that she would die before she would be separated from him, that her love was not a luxury but a necessity. And the Reverend left looking troubled and defeated, left looking like a man who had encountered a will stronger than his own, left looking like a man who understood that he had said something true, but had meant it as a kindness when it was really something else entirely. And she climbed back into the mine with the supplies she had gathered, and she prepared for the winter that was coming, the winter that she could feel in her bones, like a prophet feels the approach of revelation, the winter that every instinct she possessed told her would be different from other winters, would test everything she had built and everything she believed about her own strength, would prove whether her father's tools and her own labor could mean the difference between survival and death. On the 22nd day, she climbed out of the mine entrance in the late afternoon, and the sky was heavy. The gray clouds so low they seemed to be pressing against the mountains themselves with the weight of intention, and the wind had shifted to the north, the cold wind that comes from Canada with winter in its teeth. And as she stood at the mine mouth, watching the light die from the sky, watching the world grow cold and small, the first snow began to fall, heavy wet flakes that seemed to contain the weight of months, that seemed to contain the weight of everything the mountain could offer in the way of trial and test, that seemed to fall from a sky intent on erasure, on making the world clean and white and forgiving. And she pulled Leaf onto the hand sled and loaded it with the last of the supplies she had gathered from town, and she began the walk back to the mine, and with each step that took her deeper into the foothills and higher toward the mountain's heart, she felt something settling in her chest, something that was not quite hope and not quite resignation, but rather a kind of absolute clarity, a knowledge that the town had laughed at her because they could not conceive of how a woman and a child might live in the earth itself, and that this laughter, this contempt, this dismissal would become something else when the snow came down and did not stop, when the cold that was even now beginning to grip the valley proved itself capable of killing, capable of taking the weak and the unprepared, when the world outside the mountain became a place of such extremity that the only shelter that mattered was the shelter she had built from stone and timber, and the stubborn refusal to break. And she walked through the deepening snow with her son beside her, and the sled behind her, and the mine ahead of her. And she did not look back at the town, did not acknowledge the laughter that now seemed to be only in her mind. And she walked on into the storm, into the winter, into the future that awaited her beneath the earth, into a darkness that would become light, into a cold that would become warmth, into a judgment that was about to be reversed. The snow did not fall gently into the valley that season, but came instead as a torrent, as a vast and terrible migration of white. And within 2 days, the road from Mill Creek to the mine was erased altogether, and within 4 days, the entire Bitterroot had vanished into a white obscurity, from which there emerged only the dark shapes of the highest peaks, like islands in a frozen sea. And the blizzard that had begun with those first hesitant flakes, the evening Creel's men rode away, now unleashed itself with the fury of something long imprisoned. And when the great wall of wind and snow came howling down from the high places, it seemed almost alive, seemed almost to possess intention and terrible purpose, and it buried the telegraph poles and tore shingles from the roofs of houses in Mill Creek and piled the snow in drifts that were higher than a man on horseback in Brita, working by lamplight deep in the shaft where the temperature held steady and warm, heard the wind as a distant roar at the entrance, a roar that grew in the days and nights of the storm into something almost constant, almost a living presence that pressed against the wooden door she had built and tested the clay ceiling between the boards, and seemed to demand entry with all the implacable patience of winter itself. She did not hear this sound with fear, but with something like gratitude, a gratitude that approached reverence, for the mountain had spoken to her in its stone voice and told her that her instinct had been right and her labor had not been folly, and she understood now with a clarity that transcended explanation that she had positioned herself and her boy not in some foolish gesture of defiance, but in alignment with the actual architecture of survival. And as the wind howled above her, and the snow piled against the entrance, and the storm raged with increasing ferocity, she continued her work with the hand plane and the chisel, as though nothing in the world had changed. She had positioned herself and her boy where the earth itself would sustain them, through any extremity that winter might contrive to visit upon the world above. And as the blizzard mounted outside, she continued her work with the hand plane and the chisel, building a smaller bed for Leaf from pine salvaged from the old mine's support timbers, shaping each joint with the precision her father had taught her during those long hours in his workshop in Bergen when she was barely taller than the workbench itself, running her fingertips across the grain to feel for the perfect angle of entry for the chisel, testing the wood's resistance and surrender with the accumulated knowledge of her hands. And the boy watched from his corner, where he sat wrapped in a wool blanket that had belonged to her own mother. And he asked her questions in Norwegian, the language she had preserved in him against the forgetting that America seemed to demand of all immigrant children, the language that was becoming increasingly rare in Mill Creek, where English asserted itself like a dominating force, and she answered him in the old tongue with the careful pronunciation of a mother, determined that something of his heritage would survive the grinding machinery of assimilation, and the words seemed to carry something of the old country down into the earth with them, seemed to root them deeper in this place even as they honored the place they had left. And she realized as she worked that she was passing on not merely a language, but an entire way of being in relation to the world, a way that valued precision and care, and the slow accumulation of knowledge across generations. The mind's natural warmth increased as one progressed deeper into the shaft in a gradient that seemed almost engineered by some invisible architect, a phenomenon that defied the boy's understanding, but which Britta accepted with the acceptance of one who had learned that the earth kept many secrets and guarded them jealously. And she had come to believe that the earth revealed these secrets only to those who approached it with proper respect and attention. And she used this warmth, this free gift of geothermal mercy that asked nothing in return except her willingness to listen to what the stone had to teach, to position her living spaces with the same strategic precision that a general might use in positioning troops. The wooden door she had built at the entrance, sealed with clay and burlap to keep out the worst of the wind, that massive wooden barrier that seemed to her more solid and more real than any of the structures men had built in this territory, the stone hearth just inside, where she kept a careful fire for cooking and warmth, the heat from it rising and dissipating through the upper portions of the shaft, and then moving backward into the earth. The spaces grew progressively warmer in increments that she could feel on her skin as she walked, until at the deepest point where the air itself seemed to hum with a subtle vibration as though the earth were singing at some frequency beyond the reach of human hearing. She had arranged the raised sleeping platform with blankets layered thick and quilts stuffed with down and feathers that she had spent the previous autumn collecting from the wild geese that flew through the valley. And here, She and Leif slept in a cocoon of warmth that would have seemed like luxury to any homesteader on the frontier who had endured years of freezing nights huddled near inadequate fires, but which for Britta represented something far more profound than mere comfort. It represented the vindication of her instinct. It represented the triumph of observation over mocking laughter. It represented the strange and beautiful reality that a woman with her father's tools and her own two hands could read the earth's intentions and claim from it the resources she needed to sustain life. And in the deepest part of the night, when she woke and felt the steady warmth surrounding her and her sleeping child, she sometimes felt tears on her face, though she could never afterward quite explain to herself why she wept. She had built shelving along the mine walls, using the ancient iron cart rails as supports, fastening wooden platforms with dowels and careful joinery that she had designed herself, calculating the loads and the stresses in her mind, using knowledge that seemed to come to her hands more directly than to her conscious thought. And she had filled these shelves with the fruits of her autumn labor in a composition that had its own severe beauty. Dried fish wrapped in paper that she had labeled in her careful hand. A wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth that had been traded to her by a widow woman in Mill Creek who felt pity for her plight. Burlap sacks of flour and hardtack with their mouths tied shut against the moisture that perpetually dripped from the ceiling, tin cans of rendered fat, jars of preserved vegetables in brine that she had carried from her last trip to Mill Creek before the snow began, eggs preserved in lime that would remain viable for months if the temperature remained cool, and above these, the hanging herbs, sage and wild thyme and yarrow and sweet grass, that she had gathered during the short Montana summer and autumn and dried in bundles suspended from the ceiling by twine. The work of gathering and drying and hanging having occupied her days from the moment the snow stopped falling in early spring until late into the autumn, when the first frost suggested that her time for preparation was ending. Their scent, released by the warmth and the subtle air currents that moved through the shaft like breath moving through lungs, filled the mine with the fragrance of preparation and provision, a scent so layered and complex that it seemed to carry within it the history of the entire year's labor, the smell of a woman who had not merely waited passively for winter, but had anticipated it with the methodical precision of someone whose survival depended on foresight, and who had understood with perfect clarity that the food she stored was not merely sustenance, but insurance. It was her negotiation with the winter. It was her offer to the earth that she would respect its seasons and prepare for its cruelties, and therefore the earth should permit her and her child to flourish within its embrace. She carved small wooden spoons and bowls from pine and birch that she had traded for from a sawmill south of town, carving by lamplight in the evenings when the day's heavier work was finished and Leif had been put to sleep, the blade moving in familiar rhythms, passed down from her father's hands to her own, and these rhythms seemed to exist in her body, independent of her conscious will, seemed to have become encoded in the very muscles and nerves of her arms and fingers through years of apprenticeship, and each spoon became an object of beauty despite its humble function, or perhaps because of that humble function, each one showing the wood's grain like some captured landscape beneath lacquer made from rendered fat and beeswax that she had rendered and combined herself. The process of creating the lacquer being almost as important as the creation of the spoon, a patient simmering and testing until the balance was perfect. And she set these among the shelves as though they were treasures, though she knew they were merely tools. Yet in this place, in this time, it seemed that the distinction had become somehow meaningless, seemed to have dissolved in the particular alchemy that occurred when a person's labor was performed with complete attention and care, that a well-made spoon was treasure precisely because it was a tool, and that any hand that had made it with care and attention was performing a kind of sacred work, was honoring the world through the simple act of creation. The wood itself seemed to speak to her in this dark place, seemed to communicate in a language older than words, a language that predated human speech and would likely persist long after human speech had become extinct. And as she worked, she found her hands moving without conscious thought, following rhythms that her father had taught her hands to know in the years of her childhood, and these rhythms seemed to be connected to the rhythms of the earth itself, seemed somehow to be an expression of those larger patterns that moved through stone and wood and flesh alike. And it seemed to her that she was not so much creating as discovering what had always been latent in the timber, waiting patiently for her chisel to reveal it. And this distinction between creation and discovery seemed to her to be the most important philosophical distinction in the world. For if creation was merely discovery, then the maker was not imposing will upon the material, but rather listening to what the material was asking to become. She fashioned a small stove from salvaged mine timbers and flat stones. She found deeper in the shaft, where the old miners had apparently abandoned tools and materials a generation ago, constructing a chamber lined with clay that she had mixed herself with water from the natural seep and fine sand that she had gathered and sifted, where the fire could burn more efficiently than in the simple hearth, the heat contained and directed rather than allowed to diffuse into the vast space of the shaft, and she vented this stove through a natural fissure in the rock ceiling that seemed almost providentially placed, as though the earth itself had prepared this opening for some future inhabitant who would have the wisdom to use it. And the smoke rose through the stone and dispersed into the mountain's interior, where it dispersed into passages that the ancient miners had never mapped and would never be measured. And the heat radiated into the living space in a way that was both economical and strangely beautiful, and this too felt like a kind of conversation with the earth itself, a negotiation conducted in materials and intention, a negotiation in which Britta was asking permission to inhabit this space, and the earth was responding with that permission encoded in geology and chemistry. Leif grew accustomed to the mind's rhythm with the adaptability of childhood, his early memories already being overwritten by this new reality. The memory of the cabin and the town fading like something from a dream that the waking world had superseded, and he played in the spaces between the sleeping platform and the shelves with a creativity that seemed to feed itself, chasing shadows thrown by the lantern light that danced across the damp stone walls like living things with personalities and intentions of their own, building elaborate narratives around the flickering shapes, speaking to them in Norwegian and English, asking them questions and answering on their behalf. And Britta watched him sometimes from her work and felt a peace settle over her at the sight of her child so engaged and so warm and so safely removed from the mockery and danger of the world above. She carved for him a wooden horse from a piece of pine that she had selected with great care, examining several pieces before choosing the one whose grain and color seemed to call out for this particular form, shaping the body with long strokes of the plane that sent pine shavings floating through the lantern light like small boats on an invisible current, and then the finer details with chisels, paying particular attention to the shape of the head and the curve of the neck. The eye inlaid with a small dark stone she polished smooth against a finer stone until it gleamed like a living thing, and when she gave it to him, he held it with the tenderness of a boy who understood, even at 5 years old, that this gift represented not merely an object, but the gift of his mother's attention and her hand's knowledge. And he slept with the horse held close to his body on the nights when he was afraid of the wind at the entrance. The lantern she kept burning during the day burned low in the evening, and then she lit candles, placing one on a shelf where it illuminated the small world they inhabited. And the light seemed to gather warmth as well as visibility, seemed to make the stone itself glow with an inner radiance. And in this light, she read to him from the Bible in Norwegian, the old stories of wandering in deserts and finding water, stories that seemed to speak directly to their condition, and the boy's face in the candlelight was peaceful and attentive, and she saw in it the face of her own father as he had been when she was small, and this continuity of generation and knowledge and love seemed to her, in that moment, to be the truest thing in all the world, more real than gold or land, or the claims of railroad men with forged documents and silver-handled canes. But while Britta and Leif moved through their days in warmth and relative comfort, the blizzard that raged outside had brought the town of Mill Creek into a state approaching desperation, and Josiah Creel, sitting in the rented house near the railroad depot, found himself in circumstances that would have been comical had they not been so desperate, for the coal that heated his fine rented home had been allocated first to the railroad offices and the depot itself, and when that supply ran low, there was nothing to replace it. And the railroad company, dealing with emergencies across the territory, sent no additional shipments, and so the man who had seized a widow's cabin and forced her into the wilderness found himself cold in a grand house, the marble fireplaces drawing ice-laden air down from the chimney, his expensive furniture growing hard and hostile to the body, and he burned whatever wood the landlord permitted him to burn from the lean-to behind the house, and it was never enough. The general store in Mill Creek, run by a man named Pettigrew who had sold his goods to Creel's men on credit and now would never be paid, rationed his supplies with an increasingly bitter hand, and mothers came to his counter with their children and bought only flour and hardtack because meat and fresh vegetables had been consumed weeks ago or had never been available at all, and the children of Mill Creek grew thin and hungry, and their faces acquired the prematurely aged look of deprivation, and there was a kind of dumb, animal acceptance in their eyes that should never have been present in young faces. And Mrs. Agnes Pruitt, who had stood in the street and mocked Britta Solvang for her foolish choice of a mine shaft, now sat in her own house with her children and rationed what food she had and prayed with a desperation that she had never known before, and the knowledge grew in her that she had been wrong, that the woman she had scorned had understood something about survival that she herself had not understood, and this knowledge grew into a kind of gnawing shame, and she lay awake at night listening to the wind and wondering if she would be forced to choose which of her children to feed fully and which to feed partially, wondering if the choice might be made for her by circumstances beyond her control. The blizzard lasted for 12 days without ceasing, and across the Bitterroot Valley and the high plains beyond, cattle died by the thousands in a phenomenon that would become known in the histories of the frontier as the Great Die-Up, vast herds of cattle drifting before the wind and gathering in the lee of hills where they froze standing up, their bodies locked in positions of futile seeking, their eyes open and glassy, and ranchers whose wealth had been measured in those herds returned from riding out to check on them and found instead only fields of death and realized that years of work and speculation had been erased in 2 weeks of winter. And some of these men took their own lives, and some wandered off into the snow themselves and were never found, and some simply sat in darkness and would not speak. But in the mine shaft 60 feet into the hillside, Britta and Leif slept warmly and ate regularly from the stores she had gathered, and she rationed carefully, not from necessity, but from principle, knowing that she had no way of knowing how long the snow might persist, and she moved through the work of maintaining their small world with the same methodical attention she had brought to its creation, keeping the hearth clean of ash, maintaining the ventilation hole in the ceiling so that the smoke would rise and disperse properly, keeping the lantern filled with oil that she had rendered herself the previous autumn. And when Leif asked her why the mine was warm when the world outside was so cold, she told him stories of her father and his father before him, stories of mining in the mountains of Norway, stories of the earth's hidden warmth that had sustained miners and shepherds in the high places since time immemorial. The knock came on the door of the mine shaft on the 8th day of the blizzard, a knock that was more a sound of desperation than of strength, a repeated banging that was barely audible above the sound of the wind, and which at first Britta thought was part of the storm itself, but which continued with a terrible insistence until she rose from where she sat working on a shelf and moved to the door and opened it to find Mrs. Agnes Pruitt standing in a drift nearly to her waist, her shawl torn and her face the color of raw meat from cold, her 2 children huddled against her legs, the boy barely conscious and the girl crying with the thin cry of complete exhaustion and terror. And for a moment Britta stood in the doorway and Mrs. Pruitt's eyes met her eyes, and in that moment all the mockery of the autumn fell away, and what remained was only the simple and terrible reality of one human being asking another human being for life. And Britta stepped back and gestured them inside without speaking, and Mrs. Pruitt made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer, and stumbled through the doorway, and Britta closed the door against the wind and the world outside. She wrapped the Pruitt children in blankets and gave them broth made from dried fish and wild herbs and placed them near the hearth where the warmth could begin to drive the cold from their bones. And she examined their small hands and feet for signs of frostbite and found them reddened but not yet blackened. And she moved with the quiet competence of someone who had seen suffering and had learned the small interventions that sometimes stood between survival and death. And Mrs. Pruitt watched her and said nothing, but her eyes followed Britta's movements with an intensity that was almost painful, and Britta gave her hot broth and clean dry clothes borrowed from her own small store and wrapped her in quilts, and did not mention the mockery or the cruel words, and she did not ask for any acknowledgement or apology, but simply incorporated this new family into the rhythms of the mine as though they had always been part of it. More came in the days that followed, 3 families who had realized that the town offered no shelter, a widow named Carla with an infant at her breast and 2 other children who were trying to be brave about their hunger, 2 railroad workers who had helped Creel's men force Britta from her cabin and who could not meet her eyes when they came through the door, but whom she fed and clothed and housed without comment or reproach. And the mine began to fill with the small sounds of human survival, the crying of the infant, the cough of an old man who suffered from consumption and who seemed surprised each morning to wake at all, the playing of children who were rediscovering joy as their bellies filled and their bodies warmed. Britta organized the space with the same precision she had brought to its initial construction. the deepest portions of the shaft reserved for sleeping, the temperature there near constant and almost warm enough that heavy blankets alone sufficed, the central areas reserved for simple living, the area near the entrance reserved for cooking and work, and she dispensed the stored food with careful attention to need, calculating portions in her head with the precision of someone who had been trained to make scarce resources stretch, and she worked constantly, moving through the shaft with a kind of tireless grace, checking on the sick, encouraging the despairing, organizing and reorganizing the space as its population shifted, and the children of the town, many of them now, played among the wooden objects she had created, the toys and the bowls and the spoons, and their playing seemed to the watching adults like a gift that had been placed in the earth itself, a gift that should not have been possible, but which persisted nonetheless. On the 12th day of the blizzard, as the storm began to show signs of exhaustion, though still the wind howled and still the snow fell, there came another knock on the door, this one stronger and more deliberate, and Britta opened it to find Josiah Creel, the man who had dispossessed her, standing in the snow with his fine overcoat torn at the shoulder and his silver-handled cane lost somewhere in the drifts behind him, and his face marked with frostbite, the flesh dark and swollen across his cheekbones and his nose. And he did not speak, and he did not justify, and he did not attempt to maintain any pretense of dignity, but stood in the doorway like a man who had already begun to die, and was simply seeking a place to complete the process with minimal additional suffering. Britta stepped back and let him enter, and she settled him near the hearth and gave him broth and clean bandages for the frostbitten areas of his face and hands, and did not speak to him of his crimes or his cruelty. And Creel sat in silence and ate what was given to him, and he watched the children of the town play at his feet, the children of Mill Creek who had been cold and hungry in their own homes and who were now warm and fed because a woman he had wronged had built a place of refuge in the earth and had opened its door to all who came. And it seemed to Britta, watching him from across the hearth as she worked on a length of wood, that something in his expression had shifted. Some certainty or justification that he had relied upon had been burned away, and what remained in his eyes was a kind of empty recognition that transcended anything that words might have expressed. The blizzard broke on the 14th day, and the snow stopped falling and the wind ceased, and there came that peculiar stillness that follows great storms, and Britta unbarred the wooden door she had built and opened it to morning light that poured into the mine shaft like a physical substance, golden and cold, and carrying with it the smell of new snow and distant pine, and the gathered refugees stood and moved toward the light as though drawn by an invisible cord, and they emerged into a landscape that had been rendered utterly alien, where the familiar topography of the valley had been erased and replaced with undulating drifts, and the world seemed suddenly vast and empty and silent in a way that the world had never seemed before. The railroad sent men to search for survivors and to assess the damage, and they came to the mine shaft seeking shelter and warmth, and they found instead a community that had survived not through luck, but through the methodical competence of a woman who had understood what the earth could offer, and had been willing to live inside that knowledge, despite the mockery of her neighbors. By spring, when the snow had melted and the landscape had returned to something resembling its normal configuration, a territorial land surveyor named Thomas Whitmore came to Mill Creek investigating claims of fraud related to the disposition of property, and the story of the mine shaft and the woman who had saved half the town became a tale that multiple witnesses were eager to tell him, each witness elaborating his or her own piece of the story until the full narrative emerged, of how Josiah Creel had forged the lien documents and seized a widow's cabin, and how that widow had found shelter and refuge and salvation in an abandoned mine shaft, and how she had used her knowledge and her hands' skills to build something that sustained not only herself and her child, but an entire community in the depths of winter. Whitmore investigated and found the evidence of forgery to be incontrovertible, and he reported his findings to the railroad company, which moved quickly to distance itself from Creel's actions and to strip him of his position and to initiate fraud proceedings against him that would result in his removal from the territory and his name becoming synonymous with the kind of petty corruption that the railroad companies were constantly fighting against in their public relations efforts. And the railroad offered to return Britta's cabin and acreage to her with a formal apology and a small monetary settlement for the losses she had suffered. But Britta declined the cabin. She told the surveyor that she preferred the mine, that it was warmer in ways that went beyond mere temperature, that the wood spoke to her there in a language that she understood, that the space itself seemed to recognize her presence and to accept her work, and she filed a legal claim on the mine and the surrounding hillside acreage under the Homestead Act, a claim that was initially disputed, but which was ultimately granted because there was no competing claim, and because the evidence of her improvement to the land and her continuous residence could not be credibly denied. She began to expand the mine shaft, shoring it more securely and carefully, building timber frame rooms inside the original adit, creating separate sleeping quarters and a dedicated workspace where she could pursue her growing trade in carved wooden furniture and the small stoves that she had engineered, and which proved remarkably efficient, and word of Solvang's warm hollow, as the mine became known throughout the valley, spread among the ranchers and farmers and prospectors who came to understand that a woman who had been driven into the earth by winter's cruelty and a railroad man's greed had transformed that darkness into something luminous and purposeful. Years passed, and Leaf grew from a boy of 5 into a boy of 10, and he worked beside his mother at the long wooden workbench she had installed in the workshop portion of the mine, learning the same knowledge that her father had passed to her and which she now passed to him, learning how to read the grain of wood and how to recognize the subtle variations in hardness and color that indicated what use each piece of timber might best serve. And they worked in companionable silence for hours at a time, with the sound of the hand plane on wood and the smell of fresh shavings filling the air around them like a kind of benediction. And Leif's hands grew deft and sure under his mother's guidance, and he began to produce his own small pieces, his own spoons and bowls. And finally, when he was nearly 11, his first chair, built to exact proportions and finished with the same meticulous attention to joint and surface that his mother demanded. Britta never remarried, and she never left the valley, and she became over the years a figure of minor legend, the woman who had chosen the earth over the false claims of railroad men, who had faced mockery and dispossession and winter's worst fury and had emerged not broken but transformed. And the people of Mill Creek came to understand gradually that they had witnessed not merely a story of survival, but a demonstration of something far more profound, a demonstration of how a human being who possessed knowledge and was willing to labor with dedication, and who refused to accept the narratives of defeat that the world attempted to impose upon her, could create something beautiful and functional from the most unlikely materials and circumstances. The mine entrance became something of a landmark in the valley, its wooden door built with heavy iron hinges that she traded for from a blacksmith in Helena. The frame constructed with the same care that a master builder might have devoted to a cathedral, And through that door came ranchers seeking her efficient stoves, and farmers seeking furniture that would last a lifetime, and even the occasional traveler passing through the territory who had heard of the woman who had built a home in the earth, and who wished to see for themselves what such a thing might look like. And in the workshop portion of the mine, where the sound of the hand plane on wood continued to echo off the stone walls and the shavings accumulated on the floor, like an accumulation of transformed time, there existed a quality of peace that transcended the particular circumstances of Britta's life, and spoke instead to something universal about human dignity and the power of labor and the strange redemptive force that could flow from the simple act of making something well. And it seemed to all who encountered her in this space that they were in the presence of someone who had moved beyond the reach of fortune or misfortune, someone who had transcended the petty concerns of possession and position, and had found instead a kind of sufficiency that came not from what the world had given her, but from what her own two hands and her father's inherited knowledge and her own fierce determination had enabled her to create. A woman from Bergen had carried her father's tools across an ocean and a continent and into a hole in the earth, and from that darkness had built a life so warm that even the cruelest winter and the greediest men could not extinguish it, and the tools themselves seemed to remember the hands that had held them across generations, seemed to carry within their wood and metal the accumulated wisdom of all the hands that had ever wielded them in service of something made well. And it was in this sense that Britta Solvang's true inheritance had never been the cabin that Creel seized, but rather the tradition of craft and competence and careful attention that her father had given her, a tradition that no man with forged documents or a silver-handled cane could ever take away, and which would pass forward through Leif's hands into the future, and would continue to create beauty and utility in a world that had grown increasingly indifferent to both. One hand-planed board and one carefully fitted joint at a time, into an indefinite future that stretched forward like a seam of warmth, running deeper and deeper into the earth.